Thank you so much for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so grateful that so many folks have found this topic of interest, and hopefully we can share some information with you folks today that you can apply into the work that you do daily. I know in our advocacy work and my advocacy work, my interactions generally with DCYF are that we're supporting a parent who is trying to get their life on track, who's trying to get their children, and who's trying to maintain some sense of stability. And so a lot of our interactions are on that level. So for me, it's also kind of informative and good for me to understand how those relationships work and your guys' processes and how we can better support our folks as they're navigating these different systems. So thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen and hopefully I don't get us um, lost somewhere. So like Cassie said, we're just going to discuss missing and murdered Indigenous women and people and this connection to domestic violence and human trafficking and some of the unique components of Indian country. Uh, the alarming rates of violence against Indigenous women and people, and how that is compounded by the vulnerabilities that are the result of historical and intergenerational trauma caused by historic Indian policies, as well as really important information on how to identify and respond to domestic violence and human trafficking as MMIWP prevention. Go ahead, Jerry.
First off, I just want to thank you for spending time with us this afternoon, and I am just really excited to be here and spend time with you. One of the things that I want to start off with is doing a land acknowledgement. I am a visitor in Coast Salish territory. I am Shoshone Bannock from eastern Idaho, from the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, but I currently live and work on the unceded territory of Chehalis, Squaxin Island, and in Puyallup, also known as Olympia, Washington. And so I'm incredibly honored to be here along with Carolyn and all of you. Um, I want to really talk about that. This is a sensitive subject, and be kind to yourself. You know, it's okay to get up and step away if you need, to go to the bathroom, get up, do some tapping, take some breaths, do whatever. We're not going to be sharing gory details of situations, but unfortunately, statistics, many of us here have been victims of some type of trauma. And so we really want to acknowledge the prayers that brought us here together and express gratitude to our ancestors and for our ancestors who come before us and for their teachings, to balance our mind, our body, and our spirit, which we graciously and humbly strive to embrace and pass on to future generations. It is our obligation, but please know that we want you to take care of yourselves.
Thank you,
So
Jerry.
I
So what we're going to discuss today is the MMIW movement, and it started out as a social justice movement advocating for the end of violence against Indigenous women and people. Originally started in Canada by our First Nations relatives, and they really just sought to draw attention to the high rates of homicide and missing cases, particularly of Native women and girls who were not getting investigated. They were not getting media. They weren't getting searches. Um, they were just disappearing and there was no response to that. So it was a grassroots effort by family members who had been impacted to really raise awareness and create change. You may raise your hand if you're familiar with any of the acronyms below, the MMIW, MMIWG, MMIP, MMIWP. Those acronyms kind of are all used kind of synonymously to mean missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, or missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I tend to keep the W on there. You may have even heard MMIP, Missing and Murdered Indigenous People, but our First Nations relatives started this work in the 90s. So they really paved the way for us. And a cultural belief is that women are sacred as the life givers. And so in order to honor their work and to honor these cultural beliefs of holding women sacred and uplifting them, we kept the W and just added the P or the G to it in this presentation. So you may hear any of those terms in other spaces. Um, you might also see a lot of the color red associated with MMIW. So we may wear red shirts or call on people to wear red or red ribbon skirts, or you may see the red handprint on across somebody's face. And the handprint is just generally to symbolize the silence and the lack of interest that have been given to Indigenous women. Even the victim shaming that happens in the media. And so it just represents that silence and that we're not going to be silent any longer. But why red? Red is a powerful color. It's one of the colors of our medicine wheel teachings, but it's really been adopted as the official color kind of the MMIWP movement. And in various tribes, red is believed to be the only color from the physical world that our ancestors can see from the spirit world. And so we hope that by wearing red that we can call back and call on the spirits of our women and children to walk with us and to help us on this journey as we heal and drive change and lay them to rest and send them on their journeys in a good way. So when we talk about MMIW or missing, if we just start with missing, there's some different categories that make up the definition of missing, and how we define missing is important because it determines the way that we search for them. It determines the resources that are allocated to the search and how the search is prioritized. So how we define missing is important. You can see the different categories there. Parental family abduction is probably one of the most common for youth, as well as runaway. And I cringe when I say runaway because I really would rather that we change the culture or the language around this term and that they're missing and endangered. But the official term is runaway, so that's what we'll use. Then there's our voluntary missing, who may be folks who are fleeing domestic violence or abusive situations, and their safety and livelihood depends on their ability to remain missing. There's our endangered, maybe folks who are part of a silver alert or who might have some medical concerns that would make them an endangered missing person. There's just the general lost, maybe hikers going out and getting lost. Unfortunately, there's also our relatives who we've lost due to suicide. There's a lot of missing people on the East Coast in Florida and North Carolina right now because of the hurricanes. So there's the catastrophic missing, where folks go missing during some kind of either a natural disaster or a crisis. And suspicious circumstances, maybe we see suspicious circumstances kind of in the news all the time, where maybe the person was reported missing, family goes to the home, and there's signs of a struggle. That would be a suspicious circumstance. And then one of the rarest, but still a form, is our kidnapping. And thank goodness, that one is probably one of the scariest, but it's also one of the least common. So there's a little bit of sense of security in that. But within all of these categories, really, a missing person is a person of any age who is missing and in danger because of their age, physical or mental health, severe weather conditions, and not able to return without assistance. So if there's a concern for their well-being and we are in fear for their safety, we could file a missing persons report based on not knowing the status of their location or a change in their usual schedule or usual behaviors. So as we, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Oh, sorry. It's really difficult to tell the difference between domestic violence and human trafficking because they're so interconnected. They're not parallel issues, they're interconnected, and it's almost impossible to separate. And when we put people into boxes, whether they're DV or human trafficking, we're siloing them, and they're not getting the services that they need. And we really have to recognize the deep, long rooted intersectionality. And we have to look at the big picture, and acknowledge that polyvictimization, intergenerational trauma, and just generational familial trafficking, this can be prevented. It really can. But we have to look at the overlap. Next slide. So you might ask, what is human trafficking? As defined by the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which is the federal definition of trafficking, it came out in 2000. It is you need to have an action, and that would be recruitment, transportation, provision, even obtaining a person for labor or for sex. And then it needs to have a means, which would be the force, fraud, and coercion. And this would be forcing somebody to do something that they do not want to do. And there can be many different ways of doing this. It can be done through manipulation. It could be through like sextortion. I have this picture. I'm going to show your whole family. And then almost every single one of them has an element of fraud. And that could be called selling the dream, because traffickers target people with vulnerabilities. And they will sell them a dream. You want to be a model. I love you. We're going to be in a relationship. All of these fraud and bait and switch that happens. So there needs to be either force, fraud, or coercion. And that would be the means. And then the purpose is for sex or labor trafficking. And you have to look at it. There's absolutely no such thing as a child prostitute. Anybody under the age of 18 that is involved in the commercial sex industry in any manner is automatically, by state and federal laws, considered a victim of human trafficking. And so it's really important to understand that. And we're going to talk a little bit more later about some of the types of trafficking, but you need to look at domestic violence. It is so intertwined, because if you're looking at forcing somebody, you look at bodily harm, bodily injury, assault, intimidation, sexual assault, stalking, and usually in many cases of trafficking, it is by an intimate partner. So, or a member of their household. Next slide.
So the link between the domestic violence and human trafficking, the headline here is a post that came out a couple of years ago in California, but it was a DV survivor who was ultimately, her life was taken by her partner. And so it just highlights or shows this correlation, and we see it in the news all the time of individuals who, there was somebody broke the protection order and resulted in a homicide. And it's more and more common. I think over the last 3 years, I feel like I hear about something at least in our local area, at least once a month. But homicide was the third leading cause of death among Native females aged 15 to 24, and fourth for Native women aged 25 to 34. This has really gone up. It used to be the fifth leading cause of death. And as we kind of look at the third leading cause of death for Native women, age 15 to 24, these are our young women, often young mothers, but also homicide is the leading cause of death. Homicide is the leading cause of death for pregnant women of any nationality, of any race. 82% of Native female homicides were perpetrated by a former or current intimate partner. One of the most dangerous times for somebody to leave a relationship, or one of the most dangerous times in somebody's life, is when they leave the relationship. That tends to escalate that power and control, escalate the violence. And over 84% of Native women had reported experiencing some form of domestic violence in their lifetime. So this shows us the link between homicide and the domestic violence. And then look again at the former or current intimate partners, and we'll talk later about how that is the relates to the correlation of human trafficking. But often homicides have multiple circumstances, and data on those circumstances comes from law enforcement and the coroner and medical examiner reports, but they're very limited to on-scene evidence. And sometimes this can be, can result in a misclassification of the cause of death. And so we might have a lot of Indigenous women who might be victims of a homicide, but the cause of death might be, it might be drowning, and it's not going to take into consideration the circumstances leading up to the drowning, whether the victim's feet were tied together or their hands were, were tied shut, or their mouth was taped shut. The circumstances don't always, the cause of death doesn't always reflect those circumstances. And we can see this in the movie Wind River. If you've seen Wind River, they push to find the really root cause of why that young woman was out in the woods, not dressed for the weather, barefoot, and why she was running through the forest in deep snow in the deep winter, and resulted in the fluid in her lungs. But all of our investigations don't go that far. We don't always get to the bottom, to the root of the cause of what was really the cause of death. Often our families are left to accept that it was a drowning, knowing that it wasn't just a drowning. And then the link between domestic violence and human trafficking. Again, this is where we talk about a family member or a member of the household, or an intimate partner being the trafficker. That would meet the definition of domestic violence. If the perpetrator used domestic violence to hide trafficking, if domestic, like they pretend that they're an intimate partner, and they may get a warning or get a DV charge, but they're not going to get that more severe charge of trafficking. And domestic violence is often a precursor. Can be part of the grooming and the breaking process, in trafficking. But as long as our victims are in these abusive relationships, they're vulnerable. And we also see this in arranged marriages, where victims are groomed and married and forced to work and not allowed to leave. So we have that component of domestic servitude. But domestic violence is really all about power and
Speaker
control,
disabled.
where one person
For
uses
the audio.
violence over another to gain
Speakers
power
not
and control
working.
over that individual. And when that involves one person being coerced, or manipulated for a gain, it's both trafficking and intimate partner violence. So this is just an illustration, or a visual that will kind of draw some similarities to the correlation between human trafficking and MMIW. And this is a map that is published by the Polaris Project from the Human Trafficking Hotline. And this map is kind of a heat map of all of the calls that come into the Human Trafficking Hotline. And you can see areas like along the I-5 corridor from British Columbia down to Mexico, where that I-5 corridor is a hotspot. It's a trafficking circuit. And you can also see some correlations on different interstates and major routes. So if you look at the heat map and you look at the top 10 states with MMIW, you can see Washington is number 2. We're the second state with the highest missing people, according to the study that was done by Urban Indian Health Institute in 2018. And then Seattle is the top city in the country, and Tacoma was number 7. So if we look at these cities and compare their places on the map, as we get further into the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about historical trauma, and this will be relevant at that because we're going to look at why these cities may be hotspots for human trafficking or for missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. And then with our missing persons and trafficking, there's a term that's called missing. And due to the high level of mobility and the reduced likelihood of being reported, our trafficking survivors are often referred to as the missing, because being transported maybe up and down the I-5 corridor, or the mobility and the tendency to not be in one place all the time, um, makes it hard for family to keep track of them, to keep in touch with them, or for anybody to notice that they're not where they should be, or that something has changed, or that they're not able to get a hold of them as easily as they normally would. So it would be a missing, which I thought was kind of um, I thought it was a good way to explain, if they're missing and we don't know their status, or don't know, there's nobody to report them missing. And prostituted women also have the highest homicide victimization rate of any set of women ever studied, ever. They're 60% higher risk of being killed than non-female prostituted people. And one study showed that they experienced a death rate up to 240 times higher than any other group. That's terrifying. And that's the violence that results in homicide. This isn't counting all of the violence that was near death, or just the trauma that is experienced on a regular basis. And the disproportionate numbers of missing who have been reported, who exhibit indicators that would indicate that they're high risk for human trafficking, or have had a family member disclose in the reporting that they have a history of trafficking, or that they suspected that they may be vulnerable or at risk to trafficking at the time of their disappearance. And we can see that in the majority of uh, our young folks who are going missing often have a lot of indicators. And the indicator doesn't mean that they are being trafficked. It's not a sure thing, but it is definitely a reason for us to look a little bit deeper into their case and into those circumstances, because it helps us target our outreach to find them, and it helps us know, when we find them, what kind of aftercare services that we can proactively put in place to help them on their healing journey, with once they're recovered or found safe. Go ahead, Jerry.
It might help if I unmute. I am so sorry. I think it's really important that we talk about more about the overlap and really look at the patterns and behavior that, these perpetrators use to exert power and control over victims. I think you guys have seen the power and control wheels for the Duluth model for domestic violence. There's also another one that is specifically for sex trafficking. And if you put them on top of each other, there is so much overlap. I also want to point out that in 2017, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, testified that 12 out of 27 tribal law enforcement agencies reported identifying domestic violence during human trafficking investigations. It's super important that first, social service responders understand the link, and advocates understand the link and include, when you're looking at this diagram up here, you look at the overlap. And often, as Carolyn said, it's an intimate partner who's doing the trafficking. And this could look so many different ways. It could look as name calling, intimidation, shaming. And I've seen this over and over. I run a direct client service organization, and I have lived experience myself. I mean, it's like, it's similar to a cult, that you're convinced that you got yourself into this, and this is what life is with trafficking. And you also have to look, like in the chat, at the ACE scores and the vulnerability that are targeted to be trafficked, and also for domestic violence. You have to look at shaming. You have to look at societal views around individuals that are involved in the sex trade. A lot of people believe that every single person that is out there wants to be out there. And that is absolutely, completely 100% not true. There was a 9-country survey, including the US, that went out and surveyed individuals in the sex trade. And even those that weren't under a third-party control and wouldn't fall under the federal definition, 89.9% said they would leave right now, today, if they had other options. Domestic violence victims say they will leave right then, right there, if they could safely get away and they had other options. So that is the overlap that we are not talking about. And, often in domestic violence and in trafficking, they will use economic abuse, financial control. I have been doing this work for over 2 decades. I don't know a single trafficking victim that we have worked with that had a debit card over $10 in their purse. And they're left destitute. And that's part of the control of finances to control them. And then using threats for the legal process. Oftentimes trafficking victims are criminalized and might be on probation, and they're threatened with deportation, or they have children. I'm going to call CPS and let them know what you do. And it is just such an overlap, and it's brainwashing and cult like, and it's targeting our kids and our young people and our indigenous individuals, male and female, and our LGBTQ2I plus and our Two-Spirit are being targeted at such rates. Next slide. It is incredibly important to look at who the traffickers are. Like if you look at Hollywood will tell you it's a certain person driving a certain car, looking a certain way, and that's Hollywood. If this is the truth, and this is hard to swallow. Throughout Indian country, throughout trafficking in general, this was a study that was done by Covenant House in New Jersey, and they found that overwhelmingly 36% were first introduced to trafficking by immediate family or pseudo family, and 36%. And that is followed by a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and then by an employer, and the very lowest one is a stranger. And I want to tell you that a trafficker could be absolutely anyone. I have worked long enough that I have seen junior high or high school boys trafficking junior high school girls, all the way up to a woman that was in her middle 70s. So anybody could be a trafficker, and unfortunately, anybody could be trafficked. You have to look at this, through marriage, forced into involuntary servitude, domestic work, forced into the sex trade. Most individuals are that are not introduced familial. They may be introduced familial, and then they're broken in their trauma, and then they are, the knight in shining armor comes along, and you get convinced and recruited through false romantic relationships, and you just fall into that victimization, and you can get forced into prostitution and pornography. So many victims I've worked with are trying to get things took off of Pornhub because they did not consent to it, and it is almost impossible. I mean, you have to look at, family, and as our drug epidemics grow more and more, we are seeing this more and more often. And also with our houseless population, we have to look at survival. You may not have a third-party controller, but I can tell you here in our camps, our houseless women are being charged rent to put a tent and for safety. And if they do not have that $25 a day, they are being exploited. And survival, in order to be able to honestly choose, you have to have multiple options. And we're talking about the options of the optionless. And, honestly, on our caseload, we have about 78% women identified and about 22% male identified. And next slide. Don't know what happened to my Zoom here. Hold on. Just lost my picture. Okay, let's talk about red flags and indicators. We're first going to talk about physical. And one of the things that's really important when you guys are doing your work is to look for untreated injuries. I mean, and then also look for bruises in multiple stages of healing, because this can really show that there's been multiple attacks on multiple times. And with red flags of sex trafficking, it could be disclosure of high number of sexual partners. It could be frequent STIs, physical and sexual abuse, dental issues. That is a huge one. Most of our clients that come to us have severe dental needs, and also branding, tattoos, and changes in appearance. If you have a friend, a family member, anybody that you know, and all of a sudden things just start, looking different, changing friend groups, it could be it. And honestly, I would like you guys to start writing some additional potential red flags for physical. Can you guys think of anything? Next slide. If you think of anything, please put it in there. So behavior. This can be really difficult to look at, because you have to really understand how people react to trauma, because being trafficked is complex trauma. It is trauma that happens consistently over and over and over again. So on the first interaction with somebody, they're in complete, fight, flight, freeze mode. And so they may be, putting their head down, not wanting to talk, saying, I shouldn't be out here, all the way up to the one that's in fight mode, that's calling you every name in the book, and being really obstinate and hard to work with. And another thing that happens is, often if somebody is interviewed when they are first out of their situation and their basic needs have not been met, we don't know when the last time they ate, whatever that was. If their basic needs haven't been met, and that could be sleep, they might give a story at the beginning, and then when their basic needs are met, and in a few days, it might be an inconsistent story from the beginning. And often law enforcement will say they're lying. So I'm not going to go through all of these because of time. And if you guys can go ahead and look at some of these and write some additional behavior red flags that you guys can think of in the chat. One I am going to touch on is scripted responses. That's one thing that a trafficker will do, is have scripted responses for their victims if they come in contact with law enforcement, if they come, with medical providers or service providers. And so being able to look out for that. And also with children. sexually acting out in children and young adolescents. We really need to be looking at that, just like we would for sexual abuse. But it's really important that anything for sexual abuse that we are able to dig deeper. And another thing, using language that refers to the life or in the life or in the game or anything like that is something that you really need to look for. Next slide. Okay, if we look at environmental, um, if you can think of anything else that's not up here, please put it in the chat. One of the things about environmental is often there's a controlling person that is going to be with the person that is being trafficked, and they will often try to speak for them. And so it's really important to separate them. And, in for youth, behavioral changes, skipping school, not coming home at night, so forth, where it might look like somebody's just being delinquent, but you really have to dig deeper. And with labor trafficking, there's several on here. Homeless minors. When we're looking at minors, there is a lack of services. We are trying to get 2 receiving centers for minors here in Washington, one on the west side, one on the east side. They have not opened yet, but minors that are unhoused are, by a report by Deborah Boyer, approached by a trafficker within their first 48 hours of being on the street alone. And we have to look at how vulnerable they are. And another sign could be dressed inappropriate for the weather, over sexualized social media, posting ads, and frequent trips out of town. Next slide.
So how did we get here? So we're going to talk a little bit about the historic Indian policies that have created these systems that perpetuate violence against Indigenous people. The first federal Indian policy in 1885 was the Major Crimes Act. And at this time, tribes had the authority to prosecute or carry out justice within their land, within their reservations. The Major Crimes Act gave the federal government jurisdiction over all violent crimes on tribal land. So the tribal communities were no longer able to prosecute or carry out jurisdiction or justice over any major crime. In 1887 was the beginning of the boarding school era, and we know that this created a deep and long-lasting, deeply felt trauma that is still felt today, as over 14,000 children were taken from their homes. And that number is likely higher, but there wasn't a lot of documentation. So as the boarding school initiative moves forward, these numbers are constantly changing. But there was also the Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, which was meant to encourage assimilation into white society. This gave each of our tribal members, each member of the federally recognized tribe on the reservation, a portion of the reservation land called an allotment. And that was your family's land to work and farm and to abandon your native ways and adopt a civilized culture. The assimilation process through the Allotment Act was kind of meant to break up the communal way of living. And the Allotment Act, if you've watched Killers of the Flower Moon, this was a big source of the motivation, or allowed. It started the process that allowed non-natives to purchase or inherit native allotments and native land. Between 1853 and 1868 was the Termination Act, and this was where federal trust relations and support services to tribes ended, and they gave their jurisdiction to the states in 9 states. So it was called a PL 280 criminal jurisdiction. Federal government ceded their jurisdiction over tribes in these 9 states and gave it to the states. And so at that time, also 109 tribes federal recognition status was terminated. So we have a large group of people from like as early as, as recent as the 60s, who all of a sudden their label changed. They are still tribal people. They are still indigenous. They still carry the teachings and the practices, but they don't get that recognition and the protection and the treaty rights under that a federally recognized tribal member would get. And then in 1956 was the beginning of the Relocation Act. And this is where that map comes back into place, because the Relocation Act offered jobs and housing to Native people who would leave their reservation. If a population leaves their land, if they could get enough Native people to leave their reservation, there wasn't a need for a reservation, right? So it allowed or gave kind of justified the abolishment or to terminate tribes who didn't have a large population on their land. But this Relocation Act, where they offered jobs and housing to people to leave their reservation and move to urban areas, a lot of the cities on that map have high Native populations because they were relocation cities, because they were an area where people were given an incentive to leave their community and go to. So Seattle was a relocation city. Minneapolis, I think Albuquerque. I'm losing the names of the cities in my mind right now, but many of them were relocation cities. And so that gives us that connection, how we see those relocation cities, and we can compare the cities in the top 10 to the map and see that correlation between our missing and our high rates of trafficking that's been reported. And then in 1978 was something called the Oliphant decision, or this was a a decision that the federal government took jurisdiction from the tribes again, took jurisdiction over non-natives on Indian land. So on the reservation, any non-native who commits any crime cannot be prosecuted or convicted under tribal law. That falls back onto the city and state and federal. And so often there's no consequences at all. And so this really kind of made it a free for all, essentially on tribal land for criminals who wanted to come in a place to commit crime or engage in criminal acts where they wouldn't get caught or they wouldn't have any consequences. But the results of these Indian policies, they really resulted in a major distrust in the systems. A lot of our families have severe anxiety just over the term DCYF, caseworker, CPS, because so many of our children were taken because we weren't deemed civilized enough to raise our own children. Our culture and our cultural practices didn't sit well with non-native society, and so they deemed that we were not raising our children up civilized, and it gave the church the authority to take them. And so while it's not the church taking children anymore, our families still carry that deep fear and distrust, that historical trauma of either being taken from home and being raised in a boarding school, or having their children, taken and raised in a boarding school. But we carry that blood memory, and it still affects how we interact with systems today. But the system inequality, the high rates of Native people that are engaged in, that are involved in different systems, whether that's the foster care system or the criminal justice system, our healthcare systems, there's often an inequality in there, whether that's access or whether it's just being culturally relevant. The inequality can create these barriers for us where these programs don't resonate or they instill more fear. There's a jurisdictional maze because of the Major Crimes Act and the Oliphant decision. It's sometimes like a game of who's on first to figure out who has jurisdiction when a crime is committed. Was the perpetrator Native or non-Native? Was the victim Native or non-Native? Was it on federal land, on tribal land? Was it trust land? Like if it was a street or a freeway, that's an entirely different jurisdiction. So it's really confusing sometimes for law enforcement even to figure out who has jurisdiction in certain cases. And then you bring in PL 280, where the states have jurisdiction. It created this free-for-all, like I said, where bad guys, where criminals exploit the maze of jurisdiction, knowing that they won't face consequences. But there's also this loss of identity. The Boarding School Act resulted in a huge loss of cultural identity, the loss of language, the loss of the ability, the knowledge that's passed down on how to nurture and raise our children in our traditional ways, because they were raised in an institutional manner and not in our traditional ways. And so how that affected our sense of identity. I had an elder once say that of all the things that they took from us, our knowledge to parent was the most devastating, because it's still affecting our families and our communities. And that's seen in the high rates of youth who are in care. The distrust, again, whether that's through the law enforcement system, through having children taken into boarding schools, through being promised jobs and housing to leave your reservation, and then having your reservation and your tribe abolished, or going out of to the urban area for the job and housing, and the support that you get is only a couple of months, and there are no other services there for you. So now you have a lack of access to services, and you're disconnected from your culture and your community. And then the low prosecution rates and the high rates of violence kind of go hand in hand. The mental health issues and the substance use disorder as a result of coping with this intergenerational trauma. And it's not just if I wasn't raised in a boarding school, but I have friends my age who went to boarding schools. So this is recent history. And so if for example, if I were to have gone to boarding school, and my mother and my grandmother and my great grandmother, I carry multiple generations of that trauma. And I may not understand the effect that it has on me or the impact that it has on the way I navigate the world, but we see that in the high rates of violence, mental health, and substance use disorder.
And honestly, all of this has caused extreme historical trauma, and this affects vulnerability. Next slide. You know, historically, every fort had a brothel, and it's called human trafficking now, but it has been happening since time immemorial. And those brothels were stocked with Native men, women, and children. And the forced assimilation, removal of culture, the adoption era just has caused a fracture. And we're trying to heal from that. Next slide. And how are we doing this? We're doing this through public health and community solutions. We need to create access to programs that work for people. And we also need to really come together and work together. Carolyn?
And a lot of the solutions that we're seeing that are being implemented are task forces who are gathering information from community and from affected families, and bringing forward recommendations that are increasing the funding for these investigations, and that are providing comprehensive and specialized training, and moving forward in investigations in a way that prioritizes investigating these reports as they come in and builds capacity. But the education and awareness about education about healthy relationships, or education about like the indicators or grooming tactics and who traffickers are. We don't know what we don't know. And so we've got to be able to continue the preventive work of education. And so this is just another little informational image that kind of, again, just highlights that link between human trafficking and domestic violence and homicide. And so human trafficking advocacy and domestic violence advocacy really as a form of prevention. but homicide being the third leading cause of death for Native women, ages 10 to 24, nearly 75% of those as a form of domestic violence. I need to update this slide because the CDC's updated data was 82% were victims of intimate partner, domestic partner violence. Domestic violence in the home has an increased risk, adding an increased risk to to trafficking. And nearly 70% of female survivors reported previous domestic violence. Youth exposed to domestic violence in the home may run away at higher rates. They're also targeted by traffickers within a short period of time of being unaccompanied on the street. And then the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported that 1 in 6 runaway youth, or I would rather say we say missing and exploited, or missing and endangered, that they showed signs of having experienced trafficking. And so this cycle, it really is affecting of all ages, of all demographics, whether they are in a serious relationship or not. Our folks are vulnerable, and we can see the need for trafficking and DV education, awareness, and advocacy in order to end this cycle. And there are a lot of things that you can do. And I love the picture of this young woman. Rosalie Fish is a young Cowlitz woman who ran for the Muckleshoot Tribal School. And all she did was use her gift, right? Her gift and talent was her ability to run, which was her healing. She used running as a way to heal from her own traumas. But in this run, she painted a red handprint and MMIW, and she ran. And she raised awareness on a national and international level that we haven't been able to do in the United States since the beginning of the movement. And she was able to bring awareness to young people, to athletes, to a demographic we could never reach without her sharing her gift. So whatever your gift is, whether you're a writer, a singer, an artist, a talker, whatever your gift is, there's room for you in this movement to share your gift and talent and turn the cycle. Attend vigils and events, share our missing persons posters and flyers, educate yourself and share the information that you learn. One of my friends like to say, put your money where your mouth is, but she emphasizing the need for financial support for families with missing family members. Our families, it's not a crime to go missing. And so our family members who are looking for their loved ones are not victims, and they're not eligible for a lot of services that are going to make up the financial burden of having to look for your loved one. If you have to take time off work to search, you have to take time off work to care for your mental health. That's time off work, and gas and searches are very expensive, and our families need support in order to keep going, and donate to these organizations that are supporting survivors and families, Innovations, Human Trafficking, and Mother Nation, both two in our local area that are doing amazing work in prevention and being boots on the ground on this issue.
If you suspect that your client may be a victim of human trafficking, or if they're in immediate danger, call 911. One thing I want to really say is never try to intervene on a trafficking situation yourself. You want to collect as much information as you possibly can and be safe, because we are talking about a reusable commodity. We're talking about messing with somebody's money. If you're a drug dealer, you go out and you sell the drugs, you have to go get more drugs. Sadly, with a human, you can exploit them over and over and over again. And it can be very dangerous. So collect the information and call 911. If you see something, say something, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can call. Victims can call, they will get information. You can text if you see something, if something looks suspicious, it needs to be reported. Next slide.
And
And we
that's
just want
it.
to
Thank
say,
you.
thank you. And I don't know if we have time for any questions.
I was just gonna say, we could literally listen to Jerry and Carolyn, listen to you guys talk all day. But I'm not sure that we have time for any questions. Maybe if there's one, we can do. Our next session is starting at 2.
Wow.
But we thank you so much for your time, and we needed more time with you both.
Mhm.
We're happy to be
Just
here. Thank you.